Good evening. I'm Norman Burnett, Assistant Dean and Director of the Office of Minority Student Affairs at the University of Rochester. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the 2021 Martin Luther King Jr. Commemorative Address. The address is co-sponsored by the Office of the President and the college's Office of Minority Student Affairs, in partnership with the Office of Equity and Inclusion and the Office of Alumni Relations. This year's address has added significance. It's also co-sponsored by the Office of Alumni Relations and Constituent Engagement. This year's address has added significance. As we celebrate the 20th anniversary of the MLK address. As co-chair, I'm having some problems with this. Let me just read it. I'm sorry. The commemorative address was established in 2001 to elevate discussions about diversity, freedom, civil rights, and social justice. As such, the overarching goal of the series remains focused on its core mission of honoring Dr. King's legacy by hearing important and timely commentary from distinguished civil rights leaders, activists, scholars, journalists, and artists, while providing our students, faculty, staff, alumni, and friends from the greater Rochester community the opportunity to engage with individuals who share important perspectives on some of the most pressing issues of our time. For decades now, we have been extremely fortunate in attracting an impressive array of speakers to the series. This year is no different, as we are honored to have as our featured speaker this evening an individual whose professional work and scholarly contributions challenge existing societal and political norms, while shining a much-needed spotlight on critical issues currently affecting the divisions and inequalities of racism that exist in disenfranchised communities across our nation. As co-chair of this year's first-time ever virtual address, I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank the many volunteers and administrative departments who contributed to the planning and promotion of this event. In particular, I'd like to also acknowledge the outstanding work of the 2021 Commemorative Address Planning Committee, which consisted of a dedicated group of students, staff, and faculty from across the university community. Again, welcome, and we are indeed appreciative of your joining us this evening as we look forward to hearing from our distinguished guests. At this time, it is my honor to introduce the President and CEO of the University of Rochester, Dr. Sarah Mandelsdorf, who will offer a welcome and kick off this evening's discussion. President Mandelsdorf.
Thank you, Norm. And for the audience, I apologize in advance that I have a little bit of laryngitis, but I'll do my best to project. I really wanted to thank Norm and all of his staff for all the things the Office of Minority Student Affairs does for our university. And I'm really pleased to welcome everyone to the University of Rochester's 20th celebration honoring the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Although I really wish we could all be together in person, but this is better than nothing, and I hear we have a really big virtual audience with us here tonight. I'm pleased to have the university's Office of Equity Inclusion and the Office of Alumni Relations and Constituent Engagement join us as new co-sponsors of this important event this year. And I think that speaks, the number of co-sponsors we have speaks to a little bit about our university's commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion. And I'd also like to recognize that the Simon School of Business full-time MBA program was recently ranked as the most diverse student body in any full-time MBA program in the country, which is a source of pride. This recognition and the growing number of sponsors for our MLK celebration do demonstrate the university's growing commitment to addressing issues of diversity, equity, inclusion. However, we all know there is much more to do on this campus, in our community, and in our nation. And recent events in our community and our country have only reinforced that. Dr. King said that we still had much to do when he spoke in Rochester 63 years ago. It's important to recognize that in this community and in the nation, we've come a long way in some ways and not in others. On that January evening, Dr. King attended a private reception at the home of Dr. Charles Lunsford, Rochester's first known licensed African-American physician. Also present was Rochester police officer Charles Price, who served as King's bodyguard for the visit. 10 years earlier, Price had become Rochester's first African-American police officer. In the years since that visit, the nation has seen African Americans elected president, vice president, and appointed to the Supreme Court. But we've also seen a recent resurgence of white supremacy, violent nationalism, and domestic terrorism. So Dr. King's reflections on social justice and the struggle for diversity, equity, and inclusion are just as relevant today as when they were delivered here 6 decades ago. Back then, he remarked that both blacks and whites have a definite role to play in helping to solve the problem. He added, but progress has been made, and we'll emerge one day from the midnight of man's inhumanity to man. As he said, we have made progress, but so long as inhumanity exists in our society, we have much work to do. So today's celebration is not just a celebration of Dr. King. It's a celebration of the world he dreamed would come to be. And as Dr. King said, good people need to be vigilant and active in making that dream a reality. In that spirit, I welcome you all here and hope that you gain valuable insights from our guest speaker, I'm sure I will, on what we all can do to make our world a better, more equitable, and just place. And here to introduce our keynote is someone who is deeply committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion in our Rochester community. Dr. Kristen Dowdy, an associate professor of anthropology, is director of the university's Susan B. Anthony Institute for Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies, and the interim director of the Frederick Douglass Institute for African and African American Studies. She is also actively involved with the Rochester Decarceration Research Initiative and the Rochester Education Justice Initiative, which provides college courses inside area prisons and to formerly incarcerated. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Kristen Dowdy.
Thank you, President Engelsdorf, and thank you, Dean Burnett, and the students who requested that I participate in this event and share our discussion with Dr. Kendi. It's really a pleasure, Dr. Kendi, to be here with you tonight. Out of respect for our time and knowing that people want to hear from you, not from me tonight, I'm going to keep your introduction somewhat short, shorter than you warrant, than your many accolades and your tremendous amount of work, scholarship, activism deserves, but assume that everybody sitting at their computer can quickly Google you while I'm speaking and find the information and peruse it later. So I'll just say a few quick things. Many here, I'm sure, are already familiar with you and your tremendously impactful work. For those who don't know you, Dr. Kendi is the Andrew W. Mellon Professor in the Humanities and the founding director of the Boston University Center for Anti-Racist Research. Dr. Kendi earned his undergraduate degree from Florida A&M University in 2004 and his doctorate in African American Studies from Temple University in 2010. He's the author of several award-winning books, many of which I see on the shelves behind you. I have a few here next to me. I'll mention Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America. And because I know there are lots of parents and teachers and educators watching, I'll also give a shout out to the young adult version of that book, which I learned about from my, at the time, 5th grade daughter's teacher who sat at home with her. That's one has also been really meaningful to our family. Also your book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, which I also see there, and I know you have additional works in process and that have recently come out that I'm sure we'll hear about tonight. All to say, Dr. Kendi has a tremendous body of scholarship, has a tremendous amount of work that crosses from academia into broader audiences than most of us academics ever dare to reach, as well as activism and ongoing work that I know we're going to hear about tonight. So I'm really just thrilled to have you here with us tonight. Some people listening are new to your work, and we want to bring them on board in this conversation. Others, and perhaps more here, either know your work or many, I think, are long veterans of the struggle for anti-racist activism. Many here in Rochester, I'm sure, were marching in the streets last night in relation to some recent events that I'll mention in a few minutes. So I hope that our conversations can speak across that range of diversity in our audience. And also, even though this is virtual, I would still like to imagine us in Rochester and think with you on some of the ways that your research can help us as a community of students, of faculty, of staff, of neighbors, of Rochester residents to think through issues that are facing our city right now. So really what I want to think about tonight with you, and I hope that this in part stems from the conversations that people submitted in advance, is to think about if and how we can be anti-racist within racist institutions, right? Whether private, historically white universities or businesses, or in a city that's heavily racially, spatially, and economically segregated, given the legacies of redlining and racial covenants in our area. How can we be anti-racist as individuals in these institutions, and how can we think about anti-racist institutions? So as the first question, I'll ask you, you write about anti-racism in a way that's deeply intersectional, right? You talk about gender racism, you talk about queer racism, you talk about class racism. So I wonder if you can say more about how this understanding of anti-racism and anti-racist research that your center pursues is different from simply not being racist. So really I'm asking you to think about with us about why the language of anti-racism as opposed to some other ways that people might have talked about some of these concepts in the past.
Well, thank you, Professor Dowd, and happy that we're able to be in conversation this evening, and thank you to Madam President, and as well as all of you for tuning in this evening. Very simply, I don't think people realize when they say they are not racist that they're sharing the words that white supremacists use. They say they're not racist. I don't think people realize that Jim Crow segregationists said that they were not racist in today's terms. That lynchers argued that they were not racist. The problem were the people who they lynched. That slaveholders said, no, we're not racist. We brought these people out of the barbarous wilds of Africa and we're civilizing them. And slavery isn't that profitable anyway. So actually, this is a charitable institution. So how could we be racist? That slave traders, said the same thing. And so for me, once I chronicled this history of individuals expressing racist ideas, of supporting racist policies, of claiming those ideas and policies were not racist, of self-identifying rigidly and always as not racist, I knew that couldn't be the opposite of being racist, because that was essential to being racist itself historically. That indeed the very heartbeat of racism is denial, and the sound of that heartbeat that the individual makes is I'm not racist. By contrast, to be anti-racist is to actually say, you know what, that redlining policy was racist. You know what, that chokehold was a racist chokehold. You know, that policy that has impoverished that black community disproportionately, that was a racist policy. And I supported it. And when I supported it, I was being racist. But I'm going to change right now. And I'm going to be different in the very next moment. And so to me, the only way in which we're going to be anti-racist as individuals is to admit the times in which we've been racist. The only ways in which we're going to build anti-racist institutions and an anti-racist nation, if we are willing to admit that we have a racist nation and racist institutions. That's the first step.
I'm going to read for you. Thank you for that. I'm going to read a few sentences just as a follow-up to this from your How to Be an Anti-Racist book, and maybe ask you to speak a little bit more about them. You write, this is about gender racism, queer racism, and class racism. You write, to truly be anti-racist is to be feminist. To truly be feminist is to be anti-racist. You also write in relation to queer racism, we cannot be anti-racist if we are homophobic or transphobic. And then you also, in your section where you're writing about sort of economic class racism, excuse me, is how you name it. You write, to love capitalism is to end up loving racism. To love racism is to end up loving capitalism. The conjoined twins are two sides of the same destructive body. I know I've just put a lot of themes there together in thinking about gender, sexuality, and class all at once. So it's a big question, but I just wonder if you could say a little more in addition to what you were just saying about the ways that this anti-racism, as best I can understand it, how you formulate it, is one that is thinking very broadly in relation to these other issues.
Yeah, so thank you so much. And when I was writing Stamp from the beginning, I decided I wanted to write a history of anti-Black racist ideas. And in order to write that history, I first had to define a racist idea, because in a way, the definition then became almost like the flashlight, right? And so it took a long time to define that term, racist idea, but ultimately what I landed on was any concept that suggests a racial group is superior or inferior to another racial group in any way. And the key word, at least as it relates to this question, in that definition is racial group. So not race, racial group. And the reason for that is because when I looked at the history of anti-Black racist ideas, I saw that there were specific ideas that were targeting Black women that were distinct from the ideas that were targeting Black men. And oftentimes, those ideas that were targeting Black women were sitting at the intersection of racist and sexist ideas. And so to give an example, one of the oldest racist ideas is this idea that Black women are not really women. And one of the oldest sexist ideas is this idea that real women are weak. And so when those two ideas intersect, they have long constructed this idea of the, quote, masculine, strong Black woman who is inferior to the weak white woman who's the superior, who is the pinnacle of womanhood. And so not only, of course, did that degrade Black women, also degraded white women too, but you can't really understand that construction if you don't understand sexist ideas. And you can't fight that construction if you're not fighting sexist ideas. And if you, let's say, are a Black man, and you imagine that, okay, I want to fight against anti-Black racism, against Black people, but in my mind, Black people are men. I'm not even going to entertain or even think about the specific ideas and policies that are affecting Black women. Or if you are a woman and you say, okay, I'm going to fight for women's rights, but in your mind, women are white, then you're not even going to think about, let alone fight for the policy, fight against the policies and ideas that are specifically targeting, women of color. And so that's how and why it's critical for us when we're fighting bigotry or we're fighting racism, is recognizing the ways in which it's intersecting in the real lives of people, as Kimberly Crenshaw has long argued through intersectional theory.
Thank you so much for that. I began with those questions in hopes of beginning to open up some space for people who might not be as familiar with your work to the genesis of some of your ideas. If you're willing, I'd like to pivot now a little bit to ask you to share with you in a couple sentences of sort of some things that we've been thinking about as a city, and maybe ask you to help us think with how your work would intersect with some questions that we're thinking about. And what's foremost in my mind, and I'm sure on the mind of many people on this call, are issues of policing, both in our city and as we think about what public safety or campus safety looks like on our campus. As you may know, our city has been, much like nationwide with Black Lives Matter protests, our city has been somewhat reeling over the past 6 to 8 months after the death of a man named Daniel Prude at the hands of the Rochester Police Department. Our fall semester at the university occurred not only in the pandemic, but against the backdrop of almost nightly protests met by police responses. More recently, Earlier this month, there was a very sort of notorious example where the city police department was caught on their body cam footage handcuffing and pepper spraying a 9-year-old girl when there was a domestic dispute at her house. And then last night we learned that the officers the officers involved in the killing of Daniel Food were not indicted. There were no charges brought against them. So I say all this to give you a sense of the local manifestations of these nationwide issues and the ways people are thinking about police policy. There have been calls, of course, to defund the police. There's a new police accountability board. There are calls for something called Daniel's Law, which is a hope to bring mental health responses in lieu of armed officers. So I guess what I'm asking you to reflect on is if you could think with us around things either from your research center or in your own work, how you would think about anti-racist policing, and specifically also how this issue might translate to university campuses, where nationwide debates about how to think about public safety on a university campus are related to, they're not identical to, policing.
So I think
What would anti-racist policing be? I guess that's my question.
So yeah, let me start with the latter question, and that is that my first book was on Black student activism in the late 60s, early 70s. So I was writing along with and documenting a time in which you had this explosion of student activism by all races on college campuses, and that was largely the time in which most college campuses erected campus police forces. And that is also the time, of course, in the late 60s, where you had the emergence of things like SWAT teams and other militarized policing units off campus. I mention that because you have many institutions and colleges and universities are saying, oh, we have campus police to keep people safe. But that's not the history. The history is, okay, we need a way in which if students protest, we don't have to call police from off campus to come onto our campus. We actually have police who are trained in counter sort of insurgency techniques to undermine student protest. Let's just be honest. That's the history. And I don't think, anybody can see that and look up that history. And so I think it's important for colleges and universities to be honest, about that history. Now, I think the issue of what happened to Daniel, when I first heard about what happened to him, I don't know if I've ever said this publicly. It was devastating to me on multiple levels. Obviously, just only imagine what his family and friends were thinking. And I had some semblance, a very small semblance of that, because my brother suffers from a mental disability. And I can remember very distinctly a time when my brother got into a very heated argument with my parents, and he called the police. And then I was called, and I never drove faster than when I drove to get to that house. Because in my mind, I did not know what was going to happen, and I wanted to save the lives of my parents. I wanted to save the life of my brother. And I've been scared, of course, a lot for the lives of my family members, but certainly that reaches, the top. And knowing just how many people who were killed at the hands of police who have mental disabilities, even how many number of people who are in prison when they should be in a treatment center, it's just sort of appalling, to me. And so I took what happened to Daniel very personally, because that could have been me, that could have been my brother, and the fact that those officers were freed because they were, quote, following procedure, says everything that's wrong with those officers and procedure. Because to me, just because you follow a procedure don't mean you should do it, right? But anyway, and I also took very personally what happened to that 9-year-old girl, because I have a 4-year-old daughter. And if I saw it, that was my daughter, and I saw my daughter, I just don't know how I would have responded. And I think that it is one of the most horrific racist ideas, and specifically for those parents of black children, is to know that black children are treated like adults, and black adults are treated like children. And the fact that that police officers, that society in general, that many white folks are not going to look at your 9-year-old and see a child, and not look at Tamir Rice and see a child, and then somehow, some way, people are going to defend the actions, of those officers who didn't see that girl as a child. This is why people are so angry. And I think that if I was, I think this is why people all over the country are calling for the complete reimagining of policing, the complete reimagining of public safety. And let me just say, as somebody who was born and raised in Jamaica, Queens, in a black neighborhood that was heavily policed by NYPD, and like many people who are on the streets, last night, who've been on the streets all over this country for the last few years, they cannot separate. I can't separate police from violence. And that's no knock to, I know that there are certainly police officers who would not brutalize me. And there certainly have been police officers who have not brutalized me, obviously. But in real time, in real life, people can't separate police from violence. So when people talk about things like abolishing the police, people hear abolishing the police as opposed to abolishing violence. That's what they're talking about. And I think, I just wanted to mention that. That's what people are thinking when they call for that. They're thinking, how do we eliminate the violence? And I don't know of any other way to stop the violence than not having police. That's where it's at with people. And but then also, I think it's important for us. I'm sorry if I'm going on, but I think it's important for us to also realize that the most dangerous racist idea is the idea of the dangerous black neighborhood. There's no more dangerous racist idea. And the reason that's so dangerous is because when activists start saying, you know what, why do all these police have to be armed? Why is it that we can't train public safety officers to respond to mental health calls? Why can't we train people who aren't armed to do traffic stops? When we ask those types of questions, why can't we transfer funding from tanks to schools? People are like, are you crazy? The only thing separating me from those animals are the police and their tanks and their guns. In other words, there's this massive fear that the cause of the violent crime are the blackness and the animalistic and the criminal tendencies of those people, as opposed to across this country, you have black neighborhoods, all black neighborhoods, with low levels of violent crime. Just as you have black neighborhoods all over this country with higher levels of violent crime. You want to know the distinction between those neighborhoods? The neighborhoods with lower levels of violent crime have lower levels of poverty and long-term unemployment.
And it just so happens in white America, in Asian America, in Native America, in Latinx America, in Middle Eastern America, you have higher levels of higher levels of poverty and long-term unemployment. You have higher levels of violent crime. So I just don't understand why we can't fight crime with resources, with jobs, with basic income programs. But then again, I also know that people were opposed to abolition because they thought all those black people would like run up north like bulls and overrun everything. So they were like, absolutely not. We can't free those people immediately. We need a gradual civilization process. Those slaveholders are literally like cops. And people, right, they conceptually distance themselves from from slaveholders, but they're making the same decision now. We need cops to restrain us from those animals. Just like before they said that they needed those slaveholders to restrain them from those animals. And then you have other folks who are like, no, they're not animals, they're more like children. So what we need to do is civilize these people, develop them, and then they won't be so violent. When all black folks need, all any group of people need are resources and opportunities.
I have so many directions I want to go from there. I'm gonna ventriloquize some of my students to ask you the next question, and then we're gonna pivot to. I actually want to pivot to resources and opportunities and talk about schools in a moment. But everything you just said really resonated in part with me, and also I think with our city in many ways. Our campus. And I'm sitting here on campus right now, where people talk about how our campus sort of is surrounded by a moat of a river, and then a park and a cemetery on one side, and on the other side of that river is precisely often the discourse is mobilized to talk about the city in the ways that you just described. So I wonder if, given what you just said about how we need to reimagine forms of safety, what do you, go back to your original comment and your expertise in understanding the origins of campus policing and campus public safety, how would you imagine a reimagined campus safety in your ideal world? What should campus safeties be doing on college campuses across the country, specifically perhaps ones like ours that have these deep cliffs of racial and economic segregation outside the university?
I think that a university, so I went to Temple University, which is in North Philadelphia, which is surrounded by this massive black community, which is the poorest part of Philadelphia. And indeed, some of the poorest blocks in Philadelphia are blocks from Temple University. But then you start asking questions. Why is there so much poverty surrounding Temple? And what can Temple do? What can the university do to elevate the income levels, eliminate the poverty? Well, last I checked, universities are major employers. And last I checked, usually universities employ people from surrounding communities. And typically those people employed in low-wage positions. And so I'm mentioning this because going back to why don't we fight, quote, crime with jobs, with better jobs, with fighting poverty? A university can decide, it's in our interest to elevate the living standards of the people around us through how we pay them, right? But then secondarily, I think that whether on the campus or whether in the community, there's so many times that officers get called because who else are they going to call? If there's a mental attack, who do people know to call? Right? If someone's speeding down the road, who do people know to call? If there's a pothole, who do people know to call? If there's people are arguing, there's a domestic dispute, but it's not violent, who do people know to call? Right? And so what has happened is there's been a hollowing out of our public services on campuses and off campuses of specialized people who can respond to different forms of crisis. And then it's been put on the back of police officers who aren't trained in that area, who have guns, who are told to fear that place, who are told to fear those people. And then we wonder why this happens. And the reason why I'm emphasizing this, because I think it's important for us to not only call for the reimagining of policing, but also imagine the situation we have put police officers in. Right? A completely untenable situation. And so it makes sense that they're going to be like, you know what, we want complete qualified immunity. We don't want to be held accountable. That's what happens when you put people in untenable work situations. Right? And so, obviously, you have a serial killer on the loose or serial rapist, that's something else. But what if a university invested more resources in actually catching those serial rapists on their campuses? The university campus is the most dangerous place in our society. If you account for rape and sexual assault as a violent crime, levels and reports of violent crime are higher on university campuses than they were in urban areas in the mid-1990s. That's how expansive it is. Right, but what resources are we putting in to protect typically freshman women who are predominantly being sexually assaulted? Anyway, don't get me started.
Thank you. Actually, I wanted to, in a related question to what we were just talking about before, to shift to thinking about schooling in part because we got a lot of questions from this, and I know we have a lot of educators both in the university level and in the elementary and secondary level from both the city and the suburbs. And I'll just say, given Rochester's particular racial and spatial segregation, we have the dubious dishonor of having the largest gap in spending, largest cliff in spending between an urban and the adjacent suburban school district in the country in 2020 between Rochester and Penfield. And this is a function of obviously of disinvestment over time, of failures of the state to adequately fund the Rochester City School District in ways that it needs to, a whole host of reasons. Right now what this looks like, of course, is that in the midst of a pandemic, the only fully closed school district up until a few weeks ago was the Rochester City School District, while all the suburban districts and of course all the private schools had found ways to be open either some days a week or 5 days a week. So of course this is going to have very racist impacts on black and brown children going into the future. So, and this is just one example of these kinds of disparities. So I guess what I'd like to ask you is to think a bit with us about what anti-racist education policies might look like or education practices might look like in these sorts of situations. I know there's a tremendous amount we can talk about here, but maybe we can begin with anti-racist education policies and then get into some more specific after that.
Well, I'll be sort of concise on this one. To me, especially if we're talking about funding policies, we currently have a situation in which kids in Rochester, just as it is across this country, who have the least in their homes, typically have the least in their schools. And then we imagine that is fair. And we need to transform our policies so that the kids who have the least in their homes have the most in their schools. And at the same time, that doesn't mean that everyone else will lose. If it was up to me, every single school would be like the school some of the super rich send their kids to around me in New England. In other words, you have many wealthy white parents who are, let's say, in those suburban schools, and when they think about school funding reform, they think, oh, my school is going to be like that school that black and brown kids send there. I don't want to lose. And so in a way, they're almost like they're in first class in a jet. They're like, I don't want to go back to coach. But they don't realize they've never flown a private jet. And what we want is a private jet for every single student. But then those students who need more on top of that private jet will also have more. Why can't we have that for our kids? We're the richest country in the history of the earth.
Yep. I wonder if I'm going to add one thing that I should have said before in relation to your question about increasing wages. The U of R actually just committed to providing a $15 per hour wage across the board to as a minimum to our workers. So I just want to speak to that because I often come across as too critical of the place that pays my bills, and I'm very grateful for that. In relation to what you just said, so I just wanted to speak to that in relation to these broader questions of what an anti-racist university policies might look like. But to the schooling thing again, I wonder if you have thoughts that this might combine some of what we were saying of how we can think about school policies in relation to policing. I'm thinking of the school to prison pipeline. We've had many people talking about that. If you have thoughts about what anti-racist disciplinary procedures can be in schools and the ways that disproportionately affects different kinds of students.
So I think first and foremost, we have to be collecting racial demographic data on all the students who are being told to sit outside, all the students who are being told to go to the principal's office, students who are being suspended, and expelled at a classroom level. And the reason for that is we need to figure out what teachers need extra support and help. And I say that as the first offering, that you would come to a teacher and say, why is it that, there's this massive disparity in terms of the number of students that you're suspending, predominantly black. And so here's how we can support you to eliminate that disparity. And hopefully that teacher would be aghast at that disparity, would not say, well, it's because those kids were so bad. They would say, okay, what can I do differently? And that teacher would be willing to do so. But I think part of that has to do with the way in which the teachers are trained and supported on an ongoing basis, right? And so that we don't have to call out a particular teacher, because all teachers are severely undertrained in how to sort of manage a situation where you have, let's say, some kids who may be causing a problem because they're hungry. But then what happens also is when a black child acts up, there's teachers too many times are less likely to figure out why. And that's no different than a police officer. There's something going on. Let's try to figure out why they're acting this way. Maybe this person is agitated at this, traffic stop because they were on their way to an interview and now you made them late. Right? Instead, they're disrespecting me. And so then that, of course, elevates the situation. But I think the problem, though, is we need that data so we can figure out a way to provide teachers with support. But then I think we have to completely reimagine how we even sort of go about, quote, punishing children and how we manage classrooms. And how we think about our children and how we understand them developmentally. And it's a very sort of difficult thing, but it's certainly something that is necessary.
Thank you. I'm going to shift gears again to a question that emerges out of some of the questions that were sent in. And it's going to be a question about racialized spaces. Could you talk about that in your work? And I know you mentioned that you, when you moved to Philadelphia in 2005, you referred to yourself as being a black gentrifier in the areas around Temple. At the time, I in fact was living at 45th in Baltimore. I was a white gentrifier in Philly as well, where I was attending Penn for my PhD. My husband actually went to Temple Law School, so I was taking the trolley and the bus across to those areas. And obviously, questions of gentrification are things that a lot of our students think about in relation to university politics, in relation to the city, questions of development, questions of sort of how do we think about space in the city. So what I'd like to get us to think about now is to open up discussion around space racism, and maybe you can say just a few words what you mean by that, and then think about how is it that we can think about anti-racist urban planning or anti-racist housing policies? What do you see as some of the key sort of anti-racist either actions or policies that universities and people living in the city can take to be specifically anti-racist in our use of city spaces?
Yeah, so, of course, we already talked about funding policy. And let me just say very quickly that in How to Be an Anti-Racist, I referred to myself as a black gentrifier because I believed that black poor people were the most superior or authentic black people, and so I decided to move there so they can civilize me. And sort of, I was playing with, of course, how you have white people who move into black areas thinking they're going to civilize them, right? So, and both are a problem because, there's no authentic sort of group of black people. But I think in terms of, city planning and zoning, I mean, we could start with the environmentally hazardous entities not being parked in neighborhoods for low income, oftentimes black and brown people, and that we find areas outside of the city, away from where anyone lives, if it's necessary to even have it. And that has to take, that is something that, of course, leaders have to do, and have to prioritize. I think that, of course, many people, because they fear black bodies, when they hear about things like mixed income neighborhoods and bringing in sort of affordable housing into their neighborhood, they're like, oh my God, it's going to be, quote, black people, and then they're going to bring crime. When actually the studies don't bear that out. Right, and so, I think that we have to, and of course you're going to have developers who are going to oppose that because they want those housing prices to continue to rise, so everybody gets priced out, right, and then they continue to roll in, the money, and one of the beautiful things I think that in recent years you've had scholars show how gentrification, or I should say, not necessarily gentrification, but these, homogenous white spaces that don't have mixed sort of, affordable housing, that the prices continue to climb, which is pricing out white people. So white people are suffering, as a result, right? Because of these runaway prices that are due to this runaway notion that whiteness is better. And so I think there's so many things we can do in this area.
Thank you. I know we have about 10 more minutes, so I have at least, I ask you a penultimate question and then maybe the final question. The penultimate one, I feel like I'd really love to hear your thoughts on. The short version is, what would an anti-racist pandemic response look like to you, or what kinds of ways can we think about responses to pandemic that would be explicitly anti-racist? And I know that your institute is doing research into the disproportionate impacts of black and brown bodies of the COVID pandemic, and so I just wondered if you could think with us a bit about how we think about anti-racism in relation to the pandemic.
Sure. So first, we would have been collecting and publicizing states, counties, cities, even at the zip code level, racial demographic data, so that we could see where the hot spots of racial disparity were and respond, and be able to respond in real time. And so that data collection, obviously, from the beginning would have been critical, but then we also know, for instance, that we found out now that black people in particular have been dying at the highest rates from COVID-19, not because of black pre-existing conditions, which are due, apparently, people say, because we're so lazy, we don't eat right. That's actually not what the studies have borne out. What the studies have borne out is you have black people and even brown people who are dying at higher rates because they can't work from home. Because unlike other countries, if they can't get a replacement salary. So you have other countries who are literally like, everybody go home, we will replace your salaries, you quarantine, we get this pandemic under control. These essential workers couldn't do that. People working in the service industry couldn't do that. We would have done that, like other countries did, to save the lives of their people. We also, of course, know that another reason why black people died at higher rates from COVID-19 was because they don't have access to health insurance, which then led to black people not presenting into the hospital until they had more advanced stages of COVID. And then we also know that black people, even middle-income black people, are more likely to live in what's called trauma deserts, meaning they don't live near trauma-one centers where you can get the best high-quality, life-saving care. So then they presented the latest, and then they presented at the hospitals that did not have the ability to save their lives. So of course, everyone would have, there'd be something called Medicare for all, and there would be something called, there's a high-quality trauma one center close to every single human being in this country. And so if we didn't have that, we would build it. The U.S. Army builds things like in a month, right? They're going to build, go around building hospitals in those trauma deserts all over the country. And then we also, of course, know that a more long-term effect is you have folks who are living in neighborhoods with higher levels of air and water pollution, which has then led to their pre-existing conditions, but then has led to their higher levels of death. That's not something we could have responded to, obviously, immediately, but we could have at least moved people out of those highly dense, highly polluted neighborhoods that only sort of exacerbated the spread of the virus. I mean, there's so many things we could have done if we actually cared about people.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's just really helpful to think about, as we see across your work, the deep interconnections of all of these different issues and the ways that anti-racism as a frame and as a driver can be connected to policies at so many different levels of scale. I would say at the individual level, the institutional level, in our campuses, in our cities, and throughout our nation, and in relation to so many different kinds of issues. I was going to say more hopeful note, although much of what you're saying has been quite hopeful, but I wanted to be sure to ask you explicitly, what do you think makes for effective anti-racist activism and protest? And I ask that again because I know we have so many, that brings us back to where I began for the night and what I began with asking this about, but also to this being the MLK lecture, thinking about how do you think about effective activism in this current moment?
Well, first, an activist is one with a record of power or policy change. And I mention that because we have to bring about change. We have to bring relief to the people. Like that's the purpose of activism, not to just demonstrate a problem. And I think it's important for us to distinguish between a demonstration, which is a march, a rally. We bring people together, we talk about how horrible it was to watch that 9-year-old girl to be, in that headlock, or what happened to Daniel. That's critically important to demonstrate that problem, but we also have to recognize that there's a difference between a demonstration and a protest. A protest is an organized action that puts direct pressure on power to change policies that we've told them they need to change, right? And so, what I would sort of offer is we have to focus on power and policy change and organizing people, to make that change and driving from positions of power those people who are not committed to people, who care more about their political career than us. And that's how we bring about change.
Thank you. That's very helpful. I'm going to read now a question from a student that's related to what you just said, and this might end up being our final word, but this brings the question from the local scale to the national scale. A student writes, I'm going to read this directly. You wrote in your book, the history of racist ideas is a history of powerful policymakers erecting racist policies out of self-interest, then producing racist ideas to defend and rationalize the inequitable effects of their policies, end quote. You've mentioned voter suppression as one example of these kinds of policies. What are other exampes you see in America today? Maybe that we haven't addressed.
Yeah, where do we even begin? So you have, for instance, when you look at the top 10 leading causes of death in this country, all of them are health related, with the exception of unintentional injuries. Every other one is health related, from mental health, suicides to people dying from COVID-19, cancer, and heart disease, and respiratory disease, and so on and so forth. And the fact that you have insurance companies who are in the pockets of both Democrats and Republicans, and many Americans that imagine that it's too costly to eliminate these massive disparities in health insurance rates, which then lead to these disparities in deaths, literally. Right, so it costs too much to save lives. That's basically what people are saying. You know what? We care more about money than we do life itself. That's where we're at right now. And as we sit on the other side of 500,000 people dead from the coronavirus, when are we, as a people, going to take our lives seriously, and the lives of people who look like us serious, and more importantly, the lives of people who don't look like us, seriously. And so that's why, both the assault against those who are trying to provide universal health care, but then not only universal health care, who are trying to rebuild those rural hospitals, across the South that have been closed, that have affected Black and even white people. Those who you have literally, as some of us saw in the news, you have people who finished medical school and they can't get a residency program. At the same time, we have 500,000 people dead from the virus. Obviously, many Americans' health care is at the top, of their concern, and we have a broken system. Because people care simply more about how much something's going to cost financially than the human cost of not doing something. And that human cost is disproportionately Black and brown and indigenous people, but it's white people too. What I'm emphasizing is that, I think white Americans have to realize that they are sicker than white folks in Canada and Western Europe. You ain't gotta do it for us, do it for you. And it will benefit too. And so I just, obviously, especially as a cancer, someone who had stage 4 colon cancer, who's still trying to survive it, obviously this is something that's very dear to me.
Thank you. I regretfully, we are coming up right at the end of our time, and I just, it's in this format of an event, it's odd to me that I can't reach out my hands to all the people who are listening and watching, and have a thunderous round of applause for you. But I'm so grateful for having had the opportunity to have this conversation. I hope on behalf of my colleagues and neighbors and friends and students that I've done them justice in the kinds of issues that I got to raise with you, because I feel so deeply privileged to have been able to be the one in this seat asking you these questions, and I thank you so much for coming to talk with us. And I'm now going to turn the floor back to Norman Burnett, my colleague. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Really big thank you to Dr. Kendi and Professor Dowdy for engaging us in such a meaningful and informative dialogue. This discussion was indeed insightful and challenged us to examine what it really means to be racist, and what we should do to try to eradicate racism in our personal and collective lives. And many thanks to the audience for listening and sharing in this dialogue. As a closing event, I want to just take a few moments to invite you all to join the University of Rochester community in